The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, triune Godhead, one being in three persons, light, unapproachable, mystery, most secret. Lift our minds to contemplation of thine unfathomable judgments, and fill our hearts with the light of thy divine love, that we may serve thee in spirit and truth even unto our last breaths. For thou livest and reignest, one God, forever and ever. Amen. That's a prayer of Saint Sophrony. I'm going to start with a quote from Saint Sophrony, or start with a quote from Herodias Vlachos, who wrote a book, who he let out one time. I don't know if this is correct because I read some other stuff that makes it doubtful, but one time I thought he said that this monk who chose to be unnamed was Saint Sophrony. Anyway, he said, this is from Metropolitan Herodias Vlachos' book, A Night in the Desert of the Holy Mountains. For any of you who are, this is an aside, but any of you who are looking for books on the Jesus prayer, this, in my estimation, is the best. But you got to read the whole book. A lot of people have written books on the Jesus prayer, and I find that most of them are inadequate. They don't tell us what to do. They don't give any suggestions. They don't give any substance. And so I don't find them very useful. But this one is good. A Night in the Desert of the Holy Mountain gives you an idea. Anyway, he said, Herodias Vlachos said, I felt obliged to turn my thoughts to the heroic and respected men, the images of divine love, who abandoned the world and lived the real world, not the deformed world, but the transfigured world, who experienced the living God. Notice he says the real world. We talked last time about the culture of God, the culture of eternity. That's the real world. And he said they've abandoned the deformed world. Our particular cultures are a part of the deformed world. They're not necessarily bad. We can't help. We are where we live, and we live where where we're brought up. You would think I had incense in the room. That, by the way, is what happens when you swallow incense in the middle of the Mass. So if the priest loses his voice, just like that, thank you.
That's why incense is used to shorten the sermon.
That's right. So when one of us stands up in front of you and starts censing you, I'm giving you ideas. It'll come back to haunt me one of these days for sure. Anyway, and those who experience the living God, the things he said. So we want to live the real world, abandon the deformed world, and experience the living God. We've been talking about saints, not as examples of this culture and this world, but of the culture of eternity. And that's what, when we talk about saints, when we read about saints, that's what we're looking for. What does this individual tell us about eternity? And we want to glean something from them, what they say to us. Now, I have some things that I want to add here, and I've mentioned these in previous classes, but I have to bring them up again. When we read saints, there are principles of application of their witness to us. One is we need to know our measures. So we need to know where we are. And we all have our settings and our limitations, etc. And we need to know those things. So we have our own cultures, but that doesn't mean that limits us to our cultures. It just means that's our starting point. So if we have a saint who's Jewish, for example, and most of us are Gentiles, well, then we already have the limitation. We don't understand Jewish culture. So we're going to miss out on a lot of things that they have to say simply because we don't understand the culture. So we need to know our measure, where we are right now. That's where we start. Know my measure. And then there are the personal things like age. You know, if I'm talking about a saint who's 16, I'm not sure I get the picture, although I've been 16. I'm not anymore, in case you haven't figured it out. So I have to remember that my setting is different. My experience is different. My rank in the church is different. Clergy as opposed to lay. But that doesn't make one better than the other. It just means that more is demanded. So don't look at us and think, well, if I could just be there, I'd do better. Well, yeah, we got to start with our measure first. And then there's status. Are we married or single? Some people think, well, if I were just married, I could live the Christian life more easily. Or if I were single, I could live the Christian life more easily. It doesn't work that way. Where we are is what we have to learn to do. And if we don't learn to exercise and enter into the culture of eternity in our particular settings, we will never learn, and there will never be an ideal situation for us. So we need to know that principle of application. And then when we read some of these saints and they do these things and we're going, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. We have to apply those things to us because they do apply. We just haven't seen how. And the first thing we do is generalize the concept. That doesn't mean turn it into a metaphor. I remember when I was in non-Orthodox seminary, a professor stood up and said that the resurrection was a metaphor for life eternal. Nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. So, but I was too young and immature in those days to stand up and tell me he was a heretic. So in any case, we have to generalize it. What's the basic concept they're talking about? Let me give you an example. One of the stories that caught my attention very early on in my Orthodox journey was something on Ancient Faith Radio. It was a story of a monastic who he was an eremite. He lived out on his own. And he had very little. And one day, 3 guys came and beat him up and took everything he had. And they left him unconscious. And so they took off with a wagon load full of his things. There weren't much. And he woke up, he came to, and he looked up, and they had left 1 cup on the counter or on the wall, wherever he had these things put. And he looked at it and he ran out after them and said, wait, you forgot something. Now, first time I heard that story, well, that's ridiculous. I started to think about it, and that he was so concerned with materialism and being obsessed with things of this world that he thought even 1 cup left to him could distract him from his goal and lead him to become materialistic. And invade his passion of his passions, of many of them, like greed or things like that, materialism. He was concerned with that, and it took me years to see that. But you see, the generalization is he's combating the passions, particularly the passions of possessions and materialism. Now, we will all do that battle, but in different ways. It's okay. One is not better than another, but the measure, knowing where we are, I mean, if I went home and got rid of everything we had, Grace would have my hide. You know, I'd be hanging outside and upside down or something.
You'd be single.
I'd be single, yeah, that's right. That's right. So in any case, we have to generalize it. So you have things like prayer. What are they telling us about prayer? Fasting. What are they telling us about fasting? We don't have to fast like the monastics do. We don't have to fast like some of the great saints did, but we need to learn what fasting is and knowing our measure, how we can apply it to ourselves. You know, if we have health problems, some of us can't fast the way some of the monastics did. That doesn't mean we don't fast. I mean, in fact, it's one of the things I like about the Western Rite rules. They said they make sure that we take into account the fact that we do have health issues. For example, if we're diabetic, we have to watch about how we fast. And there are other health issues that are like that. And dispassion is a state of the spiritual life to which we are all striving, but just in different ways. And then we take the generalization. Once we get it, we apply it to ourselves. I remember one that got me early on was I admired the saints, the monastic saints who could pray all night, stay awake all night and pray for everybody else. And I thought, that's something I need to learn. I told you, so I got up at 2:00 in the morning along with thinking I was a Benedictine monk, get up at 2:00 to do matins. And I got the words out of my mouth, good morning, Lord, and I was sound asleep. And I did that a couple of times and I thought, this isn't working. So then I kept reading about these monastics and these saints who were praying all night and never sleeping, or maybe for a couple of hours. John Maximovich, for example, Saint Sophrony, Saint Silouan. And I read that and I thought, how do I apply this generalization? What's the generalization? prayer during the night hours. What can I do under my circumstances to pray during the night hours? Well, I'm a restless sleeper. I toss and I turn and I wake up a lot, even if only for a minute. And I thought, in those minutes, I could be praying. But am I? No, I'm thinking about going back to sleep. So how do I apply that concept to me? That's prayer during the night hours for me, in my circumstances. So that's how we apply the generalization. And then we have to be persistent in the application. This is one, we Americans, this is something for our culture we don't like. Be persistent in the application. We got to do it again and again and again and again and again. We aren't going to master it one time. We got to keep doing it. We don't like that, because the next word that goes with it is be patient. And in America, where everything is instant this, instant that, instant everything, we don't like that concept. And TV is reinforcing that instant, instant, instant. What goes on in TV primarily is contrary to the depths of Orthodox spirituality. And we're being inundated with this constantly. When we don't think about it, we are. So, know our measure, generalize, apply the generalization, be persistent, be patient. 5 things that we need to do, principles of application. There are 3 levels of knowledge that we will gain as we will recognize, as we learn about what knowledge of God is from the saints. One is, and this is key to understanding orthodoxy, everything we say is based upon God's self-revelation of himself. That's number 1. God's self-revelation of himself. We can't know God. We can only know what he reveals. And that's the essence of the whole story we tell. God has revealed himself. We have seen the light. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He has to reveal himself, or we cannot understand. It's foolish of us to think otherwise. So that's the first one, God's self-revelation. The second one is man's knowledge, and we've been gifted with great abilities to have knowledge. And our culture often shows us, in some of the other cultures of the world that have reached the same levels of intellectual ability. And yet we have our knowledge in all its magnitude measured by God's self-revelation. That is, if God says life begins in the womb, that's what God's order says, and we believe that. So our society says, no, life begins after the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th trimester, or when you're born, whatever. I remember seeing a movie with Patrick, what's his name? The Irish actor that used to be on Dallas. Anyway, years ago, Patrick Duffy, thank you. Yeah, disgrace to the Celtic people, but nonetheless, I can say that, you can't. Or shall I say, if you say it, say a smile when you say it, in any case. Patrick Duffy did show where he had a son, and his son was a teenager, and they were having issues. And Patrick's character said, "I've been your father since the day you were born." And I saw this years ago, even before I became Orthodox. I thought, wait. Wrong. You've been his father since the day he was conceived. So man's knowledge measured by God's self-revelation. That is, even when we come to all this knowledge, whatever it is, it's measured by what God has revealed. Another instance is when I was looking at that video I mentioned to you some months ago, and it showed the universe, it showed Earth, and then expanding the planets, and then the universe, and then the cosmos, and it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and our knowledge is so much greater now than it was even 50 years ago. And it keeps getting greater and greater and greater. And I saw that picture and I thought, and God is outside this because he's transcendent. So we could say, well, since we keep having this knowledge and it keeps going on, that the concept of a deity cannot exist. Or the concept of the deity is, according to our rationale, knowable, provable by science, and therefore just personal opinion. So, but we measure it by what God has revealed. He's revealed himself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He became incarnate and dwelt among us, and we saw him. That's a starting point for us. We believe. That's where it starts. We believe. All of the monastics and the saints believe this. They believe the same things we believe. They did the same things we do. And the third kind of knowledge is man's knowledge, that is totally limited to itself. So we go out and we build. What does the science say? Isn't that a popular phrase in America today? What does the science say? Well, that's okay, but there's more than that. How do we analyze creation based upon science if God transcends it? What I love about Orthodoxy is we got the word transcendence from human culture. I think from Greek culture, but God transcends transcendence. So if we get what transcendence means, he's greater than that. That's what we're dealing with. Wow. And that's where we're trying to go when we look at saints. Well, there are three ways in which we excuse ourselves, and that's why we try not to even think about it because it's so awe-inspiring. The first one is, well, I just don't understand. Well, of course we don't understand. That's what faith is. The assurance of things hoped for, the substance of things unseen. Or, it's not for me. Well, there's something about that is for all of us. We were all called to this, and we were all given the ability to fathom these mysteries. Or the last one, I've mentioned this already, if others would change, my situation would be more Christ-like. So when we learn all this stuff, then we want to change the world because we're really thinking, we don't think this way consciously, but it's happening unconsciously, that if I change the whole world, my life will be better. You know, our culture is changing very, very quickly. And I think for many of us, we get anxious about this because of that. What's going to happen? Well, the one who transcends transcendence transcends this situation. So we're okay. What we learned from St. Simeon the last time was that we never retire from the Christian life. So if you're looking forward to the day when you can quit this stuff and take a break, forget it. We never retire from the Christian. I'm warning you. You just set a few things aside, but the rest of it keeps going. So we never retire from the Christian life. Our circumstances change, but we never retire. There will always be something more for us to learn. I would say our arenas change, because our current setting is always our arenas. And by arena, they mean, Orthodox mystics mean the stadium where one gave witness, usually beginning in the early centuries when one gave his life for Christ. The stadium where all the people stood around cheering and hollering. We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, St. Paul said in Hebrews chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run the race that is set before us. Run the race. So that's our arena. Whatever our situation is, our arena. Each of us in this room has a peculiar arena. And we may have arenas that overlap and involve one another. Being here, for example. Putting up with this is an arena of sorts. Walking out of here wondering what on earth he was talking about is an arena of sorts. So we have our arenas. Now, having said those things, I want to look at three saints today from the Middle East. And remember, last time we looked at a Jewish saint, St. Simeon of Jerusalem. Now, in the Middle East, so this is a little bit broader. And I'm looking at them in terms of their areas, just because it's really important, again, as I mentioned last time, that we grasp that their peculiar cultures don't really matter other than to show that God is drawing all peoples to himself. Saint Hilarion of Gaza, who lived from, we think, 291 to 371, to give you an idea. He was born in a small village in Gaza, what we know as Gaza today. Might have been a little bit larger then. His parents were well-to-do pagans, so he comes out of a pagan background, who sent him to Alexandria to get an education. It was in Alexandria that he was exposed to Christianity, and around the age of 15, he was baptized into the holy faith. So he was a teenager when he heard the faith, and he was not brought up with it. This is an aside, but I remember years ago, before I was Orthodox, and I was at a camp, and youth camp, and one young man who'd been forced to go to the camp by his parents was indignant. And he said, he stood up and he said, I really don't like being here. And number two, not only don't like being here, my parents baptized me as an infant, therefore they forced me into this Christianity thing. And all I could think of, even at the time, was they gave you an option. You now have the option to say no, to walk out, to make a choice, to accept what they gave you or not, to investigate it or not. So Hilarion entered the choice at 15 when he was baptized into the faith. Upon his conversion, he immediately went into the desert to visit St. Anthony. Now, if you've studied any of the monasticism in the history of the church, you know that really Cenobitic or community monasticism started in the 4th century. But prior to that, there is evidence that there were there's evidence of monastics who lived solitary lives. St. Anthony, St. Paul the Simple are on the Western Rite calendar. They're the first two, 3rd century. And according to the way they used to teach in the St. Stephen's course, the asceticism that they were trying to seek, actually, it was propagated or proposed, even lived in the BC period when St. Elijah and also St. John the Baptist themselves lived that lifestyle. So it could be argued that people were emulating what already had been. So St. Hilarion went immediately into the desert to see St. Anthony, who had gone out at that time on his own into the desert. We'll look at St. Anthony in a few weeks. He stayed with St. Anthony for 2 months. During the time that he was gone and learning from St. Anthony, his parents died. Well, he wanted to go back to Alexandria and tell his parents, or go back to Gaza and tell his parents what he had learned. And when he went back, he found that they had died, so he sold all that he had. He got rid of everything, all his parents' estate, gave to the poor, and went out into the desert to begin the eremitic life. So let me just say something. We're not eremites. We're not monastics. We're not desert saints. But we can live these principles in our own settings. So we shouldn't dismiss them just because we're not like those people. Yeah, we are. That's what I'm trying to make. They're just more intense, and they want it more than we generally want it, which is okay. We're in the world. We have distractions. We have things about us. We have to go to work. We have families. We have obligations. But we also have this obligation first and foremost. In any case, his clothes during the time that he was in the desert with St. Anthony were a sackcloth shirt, a leather tunic, and a short cloak. Now, don't show up next week looking like that, okay? It doesn't work, and we're not impressed. For years, his diet was 15 figs a day, and he ate only after sunset. So don't try that one either. Now, here's something. He ate only after sunset, because in the early church, fasting ended in the end of the day. And usually, strictly according to the Western Rite rules, the fast ends at 3 o'clock. So I used to think that a fast was 24 hours, midnight to midnight. Well, not quite. I mean, the Muslims are closer to what we have when they fast until sundown than what we think of fasting being. So Hilarion ate after sunset. In later years, when the fig diet began to injure his health, he added vegetables and bread. So see, he altered it based upon his circumstances that was hurting his health. There's another saint, I think it was St. John Chrysostom, wasn't it, who had health issues. And
St. Gregory the Great.
Oh, yeah.
Had major health issues from overextending fasting.
Yeah. So in any case, He made baskets for a living. He slept on the open ground. Don't try that either if you're used to a bed. Doesn't work very well. Eventually, he built a 4-by-5-foot cell to sleep in. Don't try that one either. If you have a home, just enjoy it. Understand this part of your arena. When you walk into it today, say, "Oh, this is my arena." So here it is. This is where we learn to live the faith. It wasn't long before he became known, and pilgrims began to flock to him for spiritual direction. So he organized these people into semi-eremitic communities. That is, what happened when they first began eremitic communities. They had separate cells and a series of separate individuals who were all in some kind of communication with one another very loosely. So it was called a community, but it wasn't what we understand as being monastic. As we understand a monastic community. That didn't happen until a century later. So he organized these people into semi-eremitic communities. And when the communities were established enough that they could operate without him, he left because he really wanted to be alone. He wanted to be on his own. So he left and he went west. He's in North Africa. He goes west. And that didn't work. The same thing happened to him there. So he went north across the Mediterranean into southern Europe, and it was there. Same thing. Everywhere he went, it was the same story. He couldn't get away. I love this story because I'm an introvert and I want to get away too. I want to hide. I'm glad I'm retired. See, he can't get away, but I can. So in any case, when you wonder where I disappeared to, I'm just getting away, introverting.
I'll give you his address.
I'll tell you, I get no respect. He went to Sicily, Dalmatia, Greece, Cyprus, all trying to get away, all not being allowed to do so. The intensity of his prayers and attending miracles always brought attention to his presence, and he was forced to share his holy life with others. He died around 371. It is said in some sources that he never got to enjoy the solitude that he longed for. Now, what I would say is besides being a layman who did this, it's one of y'all, not one of us. Being a layman who did this, he learned simplicity and fasting correctly and exercised them correctly, but he desired solitude. We all have desires about what the Christian life is supposed to be and our place in it. But when we come into the culture of eternity, we give that up. In the end of the Gospel of John, when Jesus shows Peter being taken, his hands wrapped, and he said, "One day, when you were a young man, you went where you will. But one day, someone will take you and bind you thus, and you will be led where you do not wish to go." That is the way the Christian life is. Saint Hilarion desired solitude. He didn't get to have it because God had other plans for him. And it turns out, without him even knowing, that he was very good at organizing people into communities. And let me tell you, it's a whole lot easier to do a Cenobitic community than an eremitic community. Really is a whole lot easier. So he had to do the hard one. And yet he did, even if reluctantly, and the fact that he kept running away shows there was some reluctance. So this is what I like. These are people to whom we can relate, because I don't know about you, but I would be reluctant. So he did what God wanted, even if reluctantly. That's something to remember. Now let's look at Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, who was a bishop. Different story. He was born around 310. He lived till 386. Born in the vicinity of what we know today as Jerusalem. Brought up in the same area, so he never really left that area during his youth. His parents appear to have been Christians, so unlike Saint Hilarion, he started out with a Christian background. And they gave him an excellent education. This is what you'll find in many of the saints of the early centuries. They all went in for education. Perhaps they came from the Jewish background where reading was considered essential to their spirituality and to their understanding of reality. So he was given an excellent education. With an additional love for the tenets of the Christian faith, he quickly became a master of the Holy Scriptures. Around 344, Cyril was ordained priest by St. Maximus, Patriarch of Jerusalem. He was entrusted with the responsibility of instructing the catechumens, and he performed his function for several years. By the way, the Egyptians used to, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to, when they selected a patriarch, a new patriarch, when one died and they selected a new one, when the individual who selected was taken to the patriarchal see in Alexandria, maybe it was Cairo, I don't know. But anyway, that area, he was taken in chains, representing the fact that we only want a guy who doesn't want this job. And if he doesn't want this job, he's the man for it. So in any case, there's some suggestion that St. Cyril was sort of like this. Because of his faith and his academic ability, he gained some notoriety. This guy knows his stuff. And when St. Maximus died in 350, Cyril was elected to succeed him as Patriarch of Jerusalem. Not long after this, who would have expected it? You know, you have images of, you get into a parish, it's going to be all hunky-dory and everybody's going to get along and it's all going to be heaven on earth and you know, it's all kinds of stuff. And it never lets up. And it's for all of us. In any case, he began to have disagreements with the bishop of Caesarea, one Acacius, over authority and theology. It might tell us something about Acacius, that he would challenge St. Cyril. Acacius was a supporter of the heresy of Arianism. And he disliked Cyril probably because of that. And he called together bishops in his area to accuse the Saint Cyril of heresy. This reminds me a lot of St. Athanasius because his situation is very similar to this. Cyril was summoned to a council to answer charges concerning his theology. And when you're talking about eternity, people outside that cannot even understand it. So it's hard to explain it. How do you explain God transcends transcendence if your mindset is locked into the limits of our knowledge? How do we explain that? Instead, don't need an action. In any case, summoned to council to these charges, he was selling church systems. Isn't that interesting? The result was his condemnation and exile from Jerusalem. At least they didn't execute him, they exiled him. He fled to Tarsus, where he was taken in by an Orthodox bishop. 2 years later, another council was held to examine his case. He was exonerated and returned to his see. He then fled to Constantinople and Acacius fled to Constantinople and made fresh accusations before the emperor, the result of which was that Cyril was again exiled. Most of us would say, I don't need this kind of game playing. I'm out of here. He stayed with it. In 361, upon the accession of the Emperor Julian the Apostate, he was allowed to return to his see, to his church. Julian the Apostate had been a former subdeacon who had left the Christian faith, and he was like cousin to the line of Constantine. And when he became emperor, he tried to reinstitute the old faith, the pagan faith of Rome. And one of the ways he did it was to, when their struggles were going on between the Orthodox and the Arians, the Arians had gained control of the empire and had ousted all of the Orthodox bishops. And so one of the things Julian did in order to stir up trouble for the church was to bring all the conservative bishops back. And so Cyril was one of them. He was allowed to return, but that wasn't to last. In 367, he was banished for a third time and remained in exile about 11 years until he found a new ally in St. Gregory of Nyssa, who took up his cause. In 378, a new emperor allowed Cyril to return to his see, and in 381, he participated in the Second Ecumenical Council, which gave us the Nicene Creed. He was also one of the supporters and signers of the final version of that creed. He died in 386, having been a bishop for 35 years, with 16 of those years having been spent in exile. How many of us would put up with that? We wouldn't. But there's something about stamina and patience and persistence that speaks to us here. He never lost his faith in the truth, and he faithfully expounded that truth in spite of significant opposition and regular persecution. His catechetical lectures, and you can find, we have them in a volume in the library. They're a little bit hard to read, so be forewarned. It's not something you're going to pick up and you're going to use in casual reading. In any case, his catechetical lectures still exist and are one of the classics of Christian literature. So he stood his ground. He was resisted, even punished. Not what we would think of punishment necessarily, but he was punished. He continued to be faithful, and that's what we have to do. And this had its results. His literature became famous. He had the support of several saints, and he's remembered on our calendars. Why? Because he's such a good example to us. Now, one more, then I'll stop. St. Jerome, he's called of Bethlehem, but he actually is an Italian. But he settled in the Bethlehem area. He was a priest. And I think you'll like this guy. Some of you will, some of you might not. I like him. He lived from 345 to 420. His parents were Christians, and they resided in Stridium in northeast Italy. He was brought up in a Christian environment and was encouraged to study the pagan classics, and at the age of 12 was sent to Rome to study Greek, Latin, rhetoric, and philosophy. So he had that kind of a background. While there, he met Rufinus of Aquileia, a renowned translator of the works of the church father Origen. In time, Jerome began spending his Sunday afternoons translating the inscriptions in the Roman catacombs. I like to spend my Sunday afternoons taking a nap, if I can. In 365, at the age of 19, he was baptized into the faith. Notice the age. Almost immediately, he traveled to Gaul to study monasticism and asceticism in the communities located in that area. In 373, he left Western Europe and traveled to the Syrian desert because he'd heard that monastic communities were flourishing there. And he took up residence in a monastic community near Chalcis. This was a difficult and unhappy experience for him. That's why we need to know what our arenas are, because going to the monastery is not for all of us. Not for most of us. It was during this time, so he's unhappy monastic experience, that he learned and mastered Hebrew and perfected his Greek. In 378, though reluctant, he submitted to ordination and became a priest. He was reluctant to do this. In 379, he traveled to Constantinople, where he studied under St. Gregory of Nazianzus. It was at this time that he began translating into Latin the works of earlier church fathers such as Origen and Eusebius. Can you imagine that? In 382, he returned to Rome, where he was commissioned by the reigning pope to begin a translation into Latin of the entire Bible. So if you ever see a Roman Catholic Bible, that's from the Vulgate, which is, there actually had been Latin translations preceding the one he did, but the word Vulgate was applied to all the old Latin translations, including his, and finally representing his. So think of the Vulgate, it's the Latin Bible that he translated. Upon finishing this work in 386, he returned to the east and he founded a monastery in Bethlehem, where he spent the rest of his life, up to 420. He left his words as he left the life of a translator and entered into spiritual direction were these: now we have to translate the words of Scripture into deeds. So it's one thing to read about it, it's another thing to live it. He was a vehement, outspoken adversary of any and all heresies of the day, but he was also known to be somewhat intemperate. And this is the thing I wanted to point out to you. The Anglican Breviary says of him, and I quote, "He never was a lover of moderation, either in virtue or against vice." Now, I don't know about you, but I can relate to this boy. So we want to think of the high things, and that's the way I am, you know. No, it's the down-to-earth things, the kind of people that God chooses. A young man who's pagan background, a young man who's got a Christian background and educated, or this guy from Italy. Can anything good come out of Italy? If any of you are Italian backgrounds, I'm sorry. Remember, this is Irish talking here. We're going to look at some of their saints too, and one of them is particular. So he always was candid in admitting his failings and never ambitious for church honors. He died on the 30th of September. In fact, his feast is coming up on our calendar. In the year 420, and was buried in a chapel beneath the Church of the Nativity. Remember that he's known to have been irascible, and yet he was penitent. We can do that. We can be penitents. He resisted heresy. Got to know what it is to resist it. And he didn't seek honors. Remember the Coptic patriarch, the concept. Remember Jesus told us to take the lowest seat, to be elevated. And if we aren't, so what? It's sort of arrogant to think that we deserve honors, that we are somehow so special that we deserve honors. Now, so then I put on the board here basically what we've learned from these four saints we looked at. Seek the culture of eternity, no matter where we are. This is what we seek. We never retire. It ain't over till it's over. And it's going into eternity, it's never over. There is always something more. Always something more. Even if we master something, there's more. That's the excitement about it. There's more. We haven't gotten there. Our current settings are our arenas. This is where we give witness to what we've learned and where Christ is in our life and how important he is. And the monastics gave witness in their arenas. We can begin at any age, so we don't have to find someone who's you don't have to find someone who's 73 and say, he's the only one who would understand. Nonsense. A 15-year-old who's entered into this understands. In fact, a younger person might understand even more. Kids might understand it even more. Because they don't have all the baggage that I have, or we have. God has other plans for us. We may come in here and think, well, I'm good at this, this, and that. I used to be a really good athlete. I was a baseball player. My dad heard rumors that my dad had been a frustrated track star, and the war interfered with his becoming a world-renowned track star. He might have made it. He was so good. So when I was growing up and I was pitching in baseball and I was really, really good, Dad heard from somebody that I had major league potential. Well, here his son could do what, in his mind, what he never could do. So he put that in my mind, and it was really hard for me to let go of that. And I remember one time, years later after I became a priest, Dad said to me, you know, son, if you ever get tired of this priestly stuff, you can always go into sports broadcasting. He was still trying. I never expected my life would lead here. In fact, I asked a friend once, I had a friend years ago, I said, are you surprised at what's happened to me? And he said, no, not really. He saw some other things in me that I didn't see, but I was surprised. I didn't expect it. God has a plan for each of us, and it goes where we don't think we'll ever go. We don't even know what that is. And learn to do what God wants. That's the only way we're going to find out. We learn to do what God wants, and a lot of it's very clear. You know, what did the rich young ruler say to Jesus? What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? You know the commandments. And he said, yes, and he recited them. All right, so what do you have to learn? One thing you lack, say particular, for this individual, go sell all that you have and give to the poor and come follow me. The guy went away sad because for him, that was a big thing. And it says in there, he had many riches. So that may not be for all of us. So don't get paranoid and think you have to go. You know, St. Anthony heard that text in church and he went and sold whatever he had and went out into the desert. We don't have to be like that, but we do need to learn that lesson, however it applies to us as individuals. So we do what he wants, even if reluctantly. It's okay to be reluctant. Jonah ran away. He ran away. I love that. That's me. I'm running. Believe me, I'm out of here. That's the way to go. He ran away. Job resisted when God brought trial on him. And you can see him saying, come down here and answer me. How many of us have been like that, angry at God because it didn't go our way? And I like that, Job, the fist. Come down and answer me now. And God said, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth? Where were you? So We learned it. It's okay, and that's the essence of the story in Orthodox circles. That's part of being the people that God calls us to be. Is that we can do that as long as we get up and do what God says. That's the key. So we can be reluctant. We've got to do what He says. So take these concepts that we're learning and apply them. Don't ignore them. Don't excuse them. Whatever. Apply them as best you can. That's the starting point. Now, the next time we'll look at a few more saints from the Middle East: Ignatius of Antioch, John of Damascus, Ephraim the Syrian, and St. John Chrysostom, before we move on to some other big guns. Anyway, thank you.